Hey, Chris here from LlamAcademy, here to help you, yes you, make your game dev dreams become a reality. This is part 2 of the series where we're focusing on the introductory basics to C# with a Unity focus, so that way you're not learning maybe everything about the C# language, but more specifically the C# language that you'll be using most likely when you're writing Unity code. We're going to do 2 things in this video. The first one is we're going to take a look at what we call a loop. And as you might expect, a loop is the way that we can do the same thing multiple times, maybe with a slightly different version of it. Generally speaking, what that means is we have some block of code that we're going to execute and maybe change the index of the second part of what we're going to talk about, the array. And don't worry, we're going to go into in-depth. What is the loop? How do we write a loop? What is an array? How to define array? Why do you need an array? All of those things will be covered throughout this video. So the loop, there's a bunch of different ways that we can do a loop in C#. There's a for loop, there's a while loop, there's a do while loop, which I literally never use, so you can probably skip that section, and the for each loop, which sounds very similar to maybe the for loop, and it is. We'll look at how do you write each one of these, and a really common thing to do with loops is to iterate over an array. So let's talk about what is an array. We already talked about different types, right? We talked about the integer type, the string type, we've talked about a class, and that a class holds other types and functions. What an array is just more than one of those assigned to the same variable. So instead of just having, for example, a float, we can have multiple floats all assigned to the same variable. That's really important because very frequently we'll need more than one reference to something. For example, if we wanted to, what we're going to do in this video, have multiple TextMeshPro texts all update from the same script, we'd have to say like text 1, text 2, text 3, text 4, and that's very cumbersome to update if you need to add or remove texts, because then we need to go and modify that script every single time. What an array lets us do is have only one variable, we'll call it texts, and we can assign as many different TextMeshPro texts as we want to that one variable, within some limitations. You need a really large number for it to be too many for an array to hold. Before we go any further, I want to give a huge shout out to all of my Patreon supporters. Every one of you is helping this channel grow, reach more people, and add value to more people. If you want to join this esteemed lot, you can go to patreon.com/LlamAcademy, choose which support tier you're most comfortable with, and start getting some of the cool perks like getting your name up here on this section and getting a voice shout out starting at the awesome supporter level. Speaking of those awesome supporters, I have Raphael, Andrew Bowen, Gerald Anderson, and Autumn K. I'm so grateful for your support. Thank you. We're going to open up the scene that we did in the previous video. So far, we have one count up script attached to one UI component that has a TextMeshPro text. We drag that TextMeshPro reference there to the text reference, and it will count up that text. Now, I've attached a vertical layout group to this background. We'll drag the TextMeshPro text as a child of that background and then duplicate it 6 times. So we have a total of 7 TextMeshPro texts here, all of which have their own count up script, all of which reference their own TextMeshPro text. If we were to click play here, it would still count up all of those TextMeshPro texts, and that would be fine. Sometimes it's not a feasible option though to have one component to one item. Sometimes you have one component managing many other items. What we're going to do is remove the count up script from each of the TextMeshPro text objects and attach it to the background game object instead. For now, let's just take a look at what we can do to make one script update an arbitrary number of TextMeshPro components, exactly as we've been doing so far with just one TextMeshPro component. In the process of that, we'll talk about what is a loop, how useful they are, and some supporting things that you'll need to know when you're going to use a loop. If we open up Visual Studio, we'll see our count up script exactly as we had it from the previous video. And if we just look at this code, something immediately might come to your mind is we have 7 TextMeshPro text components on the screen. What if we have 7 variables, text 1, text 2, text 3, etc. through 7, and we just set the text of each of those exactly as we did here so far? And that is a perfectly viable solution. You can do that. It's just not the most effective way to achieve that result, because what happens if you need only 5 TextMeshPro components? Now you have to come in here, modify the script, delete some lines of code. Later on, requirements change, and now you have 10 TextMeshPro texts. So now you have to come in again, modify this to have 10 TextMeshPro text references. It just becomes a really big hassle to do. Instead, what we could do is have one field that references multiple TextMeshPro UGUI components. That would be really convenient because then in the inspector, we could just add in the references that we need to be updated and remove any that should no longer be referenced. The way we're going to do that today is with an array. Arrays are one of the most common ways that we can reference multiple of the same type. We want to have an array of TextMeshPro text UGUI components, and we want to update all of those every frame. This allows us to have only one count-up script that can update many different TextMeshPro UGUI components. Arrays are also very easy for us to define. Let's take a look at what we have here, and at the end of the type definition, so at the end of where we have TextMeshProUGUI, because that's the type we want to have multiple of, we can just add these square brackets. That's it. We've now defined text as an array of TextMeshProUGUI components. We'll notice that we get an error below in our update function. It says
CS1061 TextMeshProUGUI square brackets does not contain a definition for set text.
That may sound a little bit scary, but if we look at it really close, we can see that the TextMeshProUGUI array does not have a method called setText on it, which makes sense because now we're dealing with an array of TextMeshProUGUI components, not a single instance of the TextMeshProUGUI component. Since we've converted this TextMeshProUGUI reference from an individual reference to an array, we're now dealing with an array. So it makes sense that it doesn't have the same functions available to us that the TextMeshProUGUI component does. So obviously now this doesn't work because it's telling us it has this CS1061 error. We need to do something to make it so we're going to call that setText function on each individual TextMeshProUGUI component. That's the whole point of what we're doing, right? We want to have multiple TextMeshPro text components and we want to update all of them. That's where the loop comes into play. I am going to rename that variable to be texts with an S at the end to make sure that we're signifying to ourselves and anyone else who might modify this later that there are multiple expected text components in this variable. Let's start looking at our first loop type that we're going to look at, called the for loop. This is the one I use the very most. I almost exclusively use for loops for this kind of operation. There are specific use cases I'll use a different one, but for this kind of thing, almost always a for loop. A for loop is a little bit more complicated than some of the other ones we're going to look at from the initial definition, but it does make a lot of sense once we get into it. So I'm going to type out the for loop, just the first part, and then we're going to go over what that means. So we'll start with for, and just like the if statement, we're going to provide some parentheses. For the if statement, which is a conditional statement, inside of that, it's going to evaluate whatever we put in there to see if it's true or false. The for loop is a little bit more complicated. The for loop inside those parentheses has 3 different parts that it considers. There's for, and I'm going to put int I equals 0. Then I'm going to put a semicolon and do I less than texts.length. Put another semicolon and then I++, and then close my parentheses. So really what we just did was put 3 individual statements inside those parentheses. The first one was a variable definition. We're saying I'm going to create a new variable that's a type integer. I'm going to call it I. Whenever we're talking about for loops, I is usually the name that we use. I don't know the convention why it was created. That's just what we do. The second part of that is the condition. So very much like what we had on the if statement above, we're saying in this part, at what point should we terminate this loop? As long as this condition is true, we will continue executing this loop. That's a really important piece of this loop definition. And with all loop definitions, you need to make sure that it will eventually terminate. Otherwise, we'll freeze the computer and lock it out because it will infinitely loop. Whenever we do a loop in a little bit, we'll talk more about that. So this one, we're saying from I equals 0, for I being less than the length of the texts. What the length is the number of items in this array. So we're going to go from 0 to however many items we have in the array. And for that very last part where we have I++, that's what we call an increment statement. Having ++ means we want to increment this number by 1. It's a shorthand. It's the exact same as saying I equals I plus 1. But it's very convenient to use ++ when we just want to increment a value by 1. So the structure of this, the way this is going to work then, is we're going to first define a new variable called I and set it to 0. We're then going to check, is I less than the text.length? So in our case, if we have 7 of them, 0 is less than 7, right? So then we're going to execute the block inside. Once we've run all the code inside this block, then we'll execute this last piece of that for definition, I++. Then we return what we call the top of the loop, where we're checking, is I less than text.length? Which at this time would still be true because I would then be 1. 1 would be less than 7. We'll execute the code inside again, do I++ again, check, is I less than text.length? And we'll just keep doing that until I is not less than text.length. Once that's done, we'll move to whatever happens after the for loop is completed, after this bracket has closed. Now for the block inside the loop, we need to set the text of each item, right? And now we know we have a number between 0 and 6, where 0 is supposed to represent the first element in that array, and 6 should represent the last element in that array. This I value corresponds to the index of each element in the array. And all that means is exactly what we just said, actually, is 0 represents the index of the first element in the array. So the very first one that will hook up in the inspector will be index 0. The second one will be index 1. So you can think of his index as the item number minus 1. So if you say it's the first element, it would be index 0. If it's the second element, it's index 1. That's why we're going I less than text.length, because if we have I equal to 7, that would mean that we actually needed 8 elements in the array, because remember, it's 8 minus 1 is 7. That's where that comes from. When you access a reference to a TextMesh Pro, TextUGUI, or any other element in an array by its index. How do you reference it by its index? That's again using these square brackets and passing in the index number you want to access. Let's use this as an example. Let's take texts and do the square brackets and pass in I, close the square brackets, and then press dot. Now it tells us that we can access functions on an individual TextMesh Pro UGUI component. So we can again put set text and pass in the time display.toString n2 just like we did before. Why don't we hop back to the Unity editor and take a look at how does that look in the inspector and does it work correctly? When we open up the Unity editor again, we'll see that the countup script has texts available on it and it has size 0. Remember, countup is now on the background component. So what we can do is use this lock icon here at the top right, which will lock our inspector so it won't change when we select other objects. Select all of our TextMesh Pro text and drag it to the texts field. It will then automatically add all of these references to our array. It says now that we have array of size 7 with our 7 TextMesh Pro text references here. If we then click play, we'll see all the numbers count up correctly. We can adjust the speed and they all update at the same rate. The same is true if we go down to 0 or below 0, they all stop updating, all controlled from this individual script. Remember that none of those TextMesh Pro game objects anymore have a countup script on them. So that's pretty cool. It's working exactly as we wanted it to. But as with most things in writing code, you can do stuff multiple ways to get the same result. Let's now look at some other loops and see how they work. We'll then compare them to how the for loop works since we're most familiar with that one so far. The next one we're going to look at is the while loop. The way we define a while loop is much more simple than the for loop, but we have to have some extra code around the while loop to manage how the loop executes. I'm going to write up a while loop that does the exact same thing as we just did in the for loop, then I'll explain what's happening and compare the for loop to the while loop. I'll define an int I and assign it to be 0 by default. Then I'll type while, that's defining our while loop, and put my parentheses, put in there I less than text.length, and then the curly braces defining our while loop block. And I'm just going to copy paste what we did above because we want the result at the end to be the exact same. Finally, at the end, I'm going to do I++. So what's going to happen here? We're going to go on line 25. We're defining a new I variable, setting it to 0 by default. Then we're going to enter in the while loop. And that's checking just the same like the if statement. Whatever's in those parentheses is the condition that as long as it evaluates to true, we're going to continue evaluating and running the block inside of our curly brackets. So we're going to set the text of index 0 TextMesh Pro UGUI to be our time display. Then we're going to increment I by 1. And then we're going to again check at the top, is I less than text.length? In this case, I would be 1. So 1 is less than 7. We'll do the same thing and keep repeating until I is greater than text.length. Now you'll notice we actually have the exact same code here that we did on the for loop. We first initialized a new variable called I and set it to be 0. We defined a loop and a condition for that condition being I less than text.length. We executed some code setting the TextMesh Pro TextUGUI text to be the time display. And then we incremented our I variable by 1. So I actually prefer in most cases when we're doing this kind of loop to use a for loop because it's all done in that one line on the for loop definition instead of me having to define before I enter the loop the new variable and then inside the loop not forget to increment I because If you do, it'll actually crash Unity. You'll have to end it in your process manager because it'll be totally unresponsive if you forget to increment I. We'll enter in what we call an infinite loop. When we're doing the for loop, it's much harder to do that because you're defining all the statements up front, including what should you do at the end of the loop. What I tend to do when I'm writing a while loop is do it exactly as we just did here, and sometimes I'll forget at the end to increment whatever I'm checking. In this case, I, and I actually did it when I was recording this video, was I forgot to add the I++ and my Unity got frozen. So it's very important whenever you're doing any kind of loop to have a condition that will end at some point by something that happens in the loop. When we're doing the for loop, we define all in the same place, a variable, the condition, and then at the end, we're usually using that variable we defined. When we're talking about something like a while loop, we have to do all of that separately and independently, and it just leaves a little bit more room for us to make a mistake. I'm not going to run the code each time that we do this because we're going to literally see the same thing each time with these. They all work the exact same way. They all give us the same result. If you check out this GitHub repository or download it and open it up in Unity, you can uncomment one section at a time and see that you get the exact same result. So now we've talked about a for loop and a while loop. Now let's talk about my very least favorite loop type, the do while. I'm going to write it out, talk about it, and then explain why it's my least favorite kind. I've literally, in my entire life, never written a do while except for when a teacher made me write a do while loop for a grade. It's the only time I've ever written one. So also feel free to skip this section. For a do while loop, I'm going to do int I equals 0, then write the keyword do, and then the block of code we want to execute. So again, I'm going to copy paste my text index by I set text bit, again, exactly the same as before. I'm going to do it I++, close my do block, and then write while. That's why it's do while. And again, put the exact same condition, I less than text.length. And then importantly, put a semicolon there at the end. If you don't do that, the compiler will complain at you telling you missed a semicolon. You can see this has all the same components of what we were talking about before. We define a variable, we have a loop block, we have an incrementing our variable, and we have a check to see when we should stop executing our loop. The very important key difference here is that do block will always execute at least one time, because that while at the end is checked exactly as you would expect from how this code is written after the loop has executed. If we walk through how this executes, we define the variable I equals 0. We then execute text indexed by I, which is 0. We set that text. We then increment I by 1. And now for the first time, we check is I, which is now 1, less than text.length. Now you're probably like, whoa, Chris, why do you hate this one so much? I don't like this loop at all because it always executes that block one time, because it doesn't do that check, should we execute this loop, until we've executed it at least once. Meaning, if your text's array is of size 0, meaning we don't have any defined, we will get exceptions logged in our console every frame because text indexed by I, which would be 0, is not a value. With every other loop type we're going to talk about here, it is safe to have the text's array be empty. It is not safe for it to be empty in this case. We have to do extra code to validate the text's array is not empty before we execute this loop. And that's automatically covered by every other loop type. Anyway, the official difference between these is the while loop and the for loop, and the one we're going to talk about in a second, all will execute 0 or more times, and a do while loop will always execute 1 or more times. The final loop type we're going to talk about is the for each loop. This one's a pretty cool loop type that allows us to not have to use those indexes we were talking about. So let's look at how do we define this. This is called a for each loop. So we write for each as one word. We put up some parentheses, and instead of providing a condition here, we're going to put TextMeshProUGui text in texts. What that does is, for literally what it says, for each text component in the text's array, we're going to execute this block of code, which if there are none, we will do no times. In there, since we don't have an index, we actually have a reference to that TextMeshProUGui text, where you can just do text.setText and then pass in that time display stuff we were doing before. This is functionally the exact same as if we write a for loop with like for int I equals 0, I less than text.length, I++. If we defined a TextMeshProUGui text equals texts indexed by I, and then called text.setText, passing that time display. These are functionally the exact same, but it's much more convenient to write the for each bit because we don't have to worry about the indexing and all that kind of stuff. So the thought process that I follow is, do I care about the order of the items in this array? If I don't care, then I'll use a FOREACH loop. If for some reason I do care about the order of these items, then I'll use a for loop with the int I equals 0 over the length of the array. And if you don't know if you care or not, you can start with the FOREACH loop. And if you later decide you do need to know the index, it's very easy for you to convert it to this other format. There's one more thing I want to talk about regarding arrays, and that's how do we create new ones? So far, since we've serialized the text field, Unity automatically creates a new array for us and populates it with whatever we drag in the inspector. But what if we have an array that doesn't get assigned in the inspector? Let's take an example of making a float array. I'll call it private float array, called array of floats. And let's just say that we want to assign that to be a new array to be the same size as however many TextMeshProUGI components we have assigned in the texts variable. If we want to do that, on start is a great place to do that. Remember, that's called just before the first frame is rendered. We can assign array of floats equal to, and then we're going to use the keyword new, stating, well, we want a new float array. So I'll say new float and then define it as an array. But it requires that you tell it how big you want the array to be. What that means is, after we've defined this, we can't resize this array. We can only have however many floats, as we say with this statement, unless we say new float array again later on. In a future video, we'll talk about some other things called collections that will automatically resize whenever we want to add more items to them. But arrays don't do that by default. Once we've done this, array of floats is now defined with a value. That value is an empty float array. So if we took a look at what all the values of array of floats from 0 to, well, 7 in this case, all of them will be defaulted to the float default value, which is 0. We can assign any element inside of this float array to be any float value. So we can assign that with something like array of floats indexed by 0 equals 12.25, for example. Then if we were to check all the values again, we would have array of floats at index 0 is 12.25. And all the other ones are still 0. So you assign values and retrieve values from an array the exact same way as you would a normal variable. You're just indexing that array with that square brackets and passing in which index you want to access. Just like we did below with the texts indexed by I that gave us the reference to that TextMeshPro we were talking about. On this array of floats, doing array of floats indexed by 0 gives us the reference to whichever float is at index 0. So we can manipulate that just as if it were a normal float like we have the time display. Now we've looked at how do we define for loops, while loops, do while loops, for each loops, and how to iterate over an array of some particular type. As always in this series, in the description, we have links to all of the references that I pulled up here. So that way you can take a look in more depth on any of the topics that maybe you felt I went too quickly over. Microsoft has some really good documentation. Some of it's kind of technical, but Wikipedia also has some really nice documentation on what is a for loop because these concepts aren't specific to C#. Much like integers, strings, conditionals, all of these things are very similar in many different programming languages. So we can use more generic sources like Wikipedia to understand how does a for loop generally work. Make sure you look in the description for all of those links so that way you can further your understanding of all of these topics. Now, of course, we have homework, right? Last video, I gave you the homework assignment of making a TextMeshPro text update on the screen every frame with a random value. If you look up here, this is how I did it. This isn't the only way to do it, but it is probably the least amount of code that you can do to achieve that result. I also added something to lower the frame rate just so that way you can actually see whenever I'm running it that is updating every frame with a different value. I limited it to 10 FPS because I was getting like 300 FPS and that was just kind of silly. You couldn't really tell what's going on. For this week's homework, what I want you to do is download this repository. It's hosted on GitHub, so you can go to the link in the description, download that project, and we're going to use that as a starting point. If you've been following along and everything's working exactly as we've done here, you can also just use your own project. What I want you to do is have each TextMeshPro text update with the time display, but I want you to update only one TextMeshPro text each frame. So if we have 7 TextMeshPro texts on the screen, the first frame, the first one should show the time display. The second frame, the second TextMeshPro text should be updated and the first one should not change. On the third frame, the third TextMeshPro text should update and the first 2 do not change, etc. all the way through. Once we get to the end of that, where we have all 7 that have been updated, on the 8th frame, we should return to the top and update only that first TextMeshPro text again. It should look something like this when you're done. And again, I've slowed it down so that way you can see how it should behave. And on the next video in this series, what we're going to do is take a look at how did I implement this. You can compare how did I do it to how did you do it, see which one maybe works better or was easier to implement. But I think we've talked about everything so far between the last video and this video on how you can do it. You're probably going to have to think about it a little bit. That's why it's homework. But it's going to be about another 4 weeks before the next one, so you've got some time to think about it and figure it out. If you got value out of this video or you've been getting value out of this series, please consider liking and subscribing to help the channel grow, reach more people, and add value to more people. There's new videos posted every Tuesday, and I'll see you next week.